Hi and welcome. It's April 30th. We are late in the afternoon, a little past 5 o'clock here in Israel, toward the end of Yom HaZikaron, Memorial Day, when we commemorate the 25,420 Israelis who were either killed in battle, fell during their military service, or were murdered by our enemies, primarily Palestinian terrorist organizations. It's a particularly difficult day this year with a war still going on, casualties still being counted up until the past few days, and the fighting isn't over. Uh, Hostages still being held alive and dead in Gaza by Hamas and other terrorist organizations. So, beyond the usual very real sense of Memorial Day, this year, of course, it's all the more current in the hope against hope anticipation that we won't be seeing any more casualties in the coming year, but knowing reasonably well that we will. But what I want to talk about today is what happens tonight after Memorial Day, and that is Independence Day, and the celebrations that begin typically immediately at the end of Memorial Day, and the days are adjacent intentionally so that while we are celebrating our independence, we have just come off commemorating and memorializing those who paid the price for our independence, the ultimate price, and in a very Jewish sort of way, going from sorrow to happiness and having our happiness mixed with that sorrow. But this year in particular, for the same reasons that Memorial Day is so current in real time, there have been calls for not celebrating Independence Day. And I want to address those because although I don't think it's a very large movement, it's a very loud one. And it bears, I think, some attention. The primary call is coming from either former hostages or from the families of hostages. Now, it's my opinion, and I've expressed this in interviews and I think in some previous podcasts, that on a personal level, we don't argue with those who have lost loved ones. We don't argue with those who have gone through deep trauma, like having been held hostage, even if now released. These are permanent scars, and they're personal. And on a personal level, there's really not an argument. They can say what they like without being confronted with any sort of direct counter or debate. It's a sort of human right that they've unfortunately earned the hard way. But calling for the country not to celebrate its independence goes beyond a simple statement, say, of criticism of the leadership for example, what was clearly a horrific failure by the system on October 7th, 2023. The idea that we don't celebrate independence as long as there are hostages being held. I can't celebrate independence, says one, because I was held hostage and my heart is still in Gaza. We have no independence if everybody doesn't have independence. And calls of that sort, which have come out of the protest movement that surrounds some of the hostage families, and includes the End the War movement, the anti-Bibi movement, and the like, simply saying that the nation needs to continue its mourning, essentially, from Memorial Day into Independence Day as well, because the state is a failure. And here I want to address that, because having failed on October 7th, and there's no question that the state and its systems failed, that doesn't make the state a failure. And looking at it that way essentially ignores millennia of Jewish history. So let's start by going back. What is the purpose of the state? What is it doing here? What has it achieved and under what circumstances? And what are the alternatives? And are we in a better place or worse having created the state, even with its failures and, of course, the great failure of October 7th? So first and foremost, the state was created for a number of reasons, but one certainly, and certainly in the years following the Holocaust, as not only a refuge in the sense of a place to go, because Jews obviously couldn't flee Europe because nobody would let them in the 1930s, and once the war broke out in 1939 and into the early 1940s. Those who tried to escape, in some cases, were thwarted by the countries that they were trying to escape to, including the United States, including Great Britain, including Britain's blockade of the land of Israel, then called Mandatory Palestine. And Jews were returned to Europe by these countries and others to face their horrific fate at the hands of the Nazis. And of course, in its aftermath, there was always the saying, correct insofar as it goes, that had there been a state of Israel in the 1930s, all of these people could have gotten out, and that's certainly true. But beyond being a refuge, the land of Israel is historically the land of the Jewish people, and the establishment of a state here is the fulfillment of a dream that goes back literally 2,000 years. So in and of itself, the state has a Jewish historical value, and that's before getting into religious issues of the coming of the Messiah. I'm going to leave that aside for a moment, not because it's not important, but it's not relevant to this part of the discussion. The immediate need for a state, as seen by the early Zionists, and particularly Theodor Herzl, but not exclusively, and later Zev Jabotinsky and others, was not only as a refuge, but were a place that Jews could feel a sense of security. And one could argue that after October 7th, there is no sense of security, but that would be a very shallow, superficial argument, particularly in light of Jewish history. Let's keep in mind that with all of the failures of the 7th, Hamas, which is an extension of a radical Islamic Nazi-type organization called the Muslim Brotherhood, and its spin-offs that include Al-Qaeda and others, and the Iranian regime, set as their objective the annihilation of the Jewish people, having nothing to do with issues of politics of the State of Israel. It should be noted that even the demonstrations that have been held in Europe and the United States, every now and then you see slipped in terms like final solution. They're not talking about from the river to the sea in a positive, let there be freedom sense. They're talking about from the river to the sea and beyond to annihilate the Jewish people. And they make no secret about it if you scratch just slightly below the surface presented to you by BBC, Reuters, CNN, the New York Times, and the like. So as horrific as what happened was on October 7th, we should keep in mind that there was no October 8th. And even on the 7th, the system, which responded very slowly, began to respond, in some cases, in the early cases, unofficially, with reservists and others rushing into the combat zone, protecting people simply because, as extensions of the state, as citizens, They had the training, the knowledge, the equipment to go in and protect the victims who were being massacred by the 6,000 plus Hamas terrorists who had made their way into southern Israel. And if we were to draw a particularly horrific extreme by comparison, let's look for a moment at 3 horrendous days in September 1941 in the area of Kiev, where Einsatzgruppe C of the Nazis, numbering a total of 1,000 men, rounded up and murdered 33,000 Jews in 2.5 days. There was nobody to come to their rescue. They were incapable of defending themselves. And over 2.5 days, the Nazis of Einsatzgruppe C, with the support of some of the Ukrainian local population, murdered 33,000 Jews. On October 7th, 6,000 terrorists entered Israel. And within 24 to 36 hours, not a single one of them was still operating on the Israeli side of the border. Now, some of them had fled back into Gaza with hostages. Some of them were still wandering around the desert and were picked up over the next week or two. But as a murder force, and I don't want to refer to it purely as a fighting force, but as a murder force, they were completely defeated in a little over a day. This was part of the reality of having an independent state with a military. So I would say, with a view of Jewish history, understanding where we are today compared to where we were, celebrating our independence starting tonight and through tomorrow is an imperative. It's a statement to ourselves. It's a statement to our enemies that, having done what they did, they're not breaking us, and we will celebrate. If the Jews in Auschwitz could celebrate the Jewish holidays, if hostages in the tunnels of Gaza were able to at least nominally maintain an awareness of Shabbat and the holidays, it's incumbent upon us to celebrate Israel's Independence Day tomorrow as part of that great statement that we are still here, we are not going anywhere, and they will not break us. So, with that, in the hours ahead, Yom Ha'atzmaut Sameach, Happy Independence Day, and Am Yisrael Chai.